The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos walked toward the flight line. Her boots clicked against the concrete, each step carrying the weight of 5 years of proving herself in a world that still questioned whether a woman belonged under the hood of an F-16 Fighting Falcon. Maria had grown up in a small town in Texas where her father ran an auto repair shop. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, she was learning the difference between a wrench and a socket set. By the time she was 16, she could diagnose engine problems just by listening to the sound they made. Her father always said she had magic in her fingers and music in her ears when it came to machines. When Maria enlisted in the Air Force, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. The recruiters tried to steer her toward administration or medical fields, but she insisted on aircraft maintenance. The training was brutal, not because of the technical demands, but because of the constant doubt from her male colleagues. They questioned every decision she made, double-checked her work, and whispered behind her back about quotas and special treatment. But Maria let her work speak for itself. She memorized every system, every component, every possible failure point of the F-16. While others relied on manuals and computer diagnostics, Maria developed an almost supernatural ability to understand what the aircraft needed. She could hear problems in the engine that sophisticated equipment missed. She could feel vibrations in the airframe that indicated issues days before they would show up on routine inspections. The flight line at Nellis was home to the 64th Aggressor Squadron, pilots who flew missions designed to simulate enemy aircraft in training exercises. These were some of the most skilled pilots in the Air Force, and their aircraft were pushed to the absolute limits of performance. The F-16s they flew were older models, constantly stressed by aggressive maneuvering and high-G training flights. Captain Jake Morrison was the squadron's most experienced pilot, a man who had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and had more hours in the F-16 than most people had driving cars. He was also one of the loudest voices questioning whether Maria belonged on his flight line. Every time she performed maintenance on his aircraft, he would inspect her work personally, looking for any excuse to complain to the maintenance supervisor. "I don't care what the Air Force says about equal opportunity," Morrison had told his fellow pilots more than once. "When my life depends on that engine starting and those systems working, I want someone with real experience touching my bird, not some diversity hire who learned everything from a book." The other mechanics in Maria's unit had mixed feelings about her presence. Some, like Technical Sergeant Mike Chen, recognized her skill and treated her as an equal. Chen had served for 12 years and had seen plenty of mechanics come and go. He judged people by their work, not their gender. Others, like Staff Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, resented what they saw as special treatment and opportunities that should have gone to men who had been waiting longer for advancement. Master Sergeant David Thompson, the chief of aircraft maintenance, found himself caught in the middle. He had served for 22 years and had never supervised a female mechanic before Maria arrived. His first instinct had been skepticism, but Maria's performance record was undeniable. Her aircraft had the lowest failure rate in the squadron, and pilots who flew planes she maintained consistently reported better performance and reliability. Still, Thompson felt pressure from above to integrate women into traditionally male roles, and pressure from below from mechanics who felt the change was happening too fast. He dealt with it by maintaining strict standards for everyone, and letting results determine assignments. Maria had earned her place through competence, but he knew that one mistake, one oversight, one failure could set back female integration in aircraft maintenance by years. The hangar where Maria worked was a cathedral of technology and precision. F-16s sat in various stages of maintenance, their sleek forms surrounded by scaffolding, diagnostic equipment, and tool carts. The smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and metal filled the air. The sound of pneumatic tools, computer terminals, and radio chatter created a constant background symphony that Maria found more comforting than silence. Her particular area of expertise was engine systems and avionics. The F-16's General Electric F-110 engine was a marvel of engineering, producing over 29,000 pounds of thrust while weighing less than 4,000 pounds. The avionics systems that controlled flight, navigation, and weapons were equally complex, with thousands of components that had to work in perfect harmony for the aircraft to function safely. Maria had developed her own methods for troubleshooting problems that went beyond standard procedures. She would place her hands on different parts of the engine while it was running, feeling for vibrations that indicated worn bearings or misaligned components. She would listen to the subtle changes in engine tone that revealed problems with fuel injection or exhaust systems. Her colleagues called it intuition, but Maria knew it was simply the result of paying attention to details that others missed. On this particular morning, Maria was scheduled to perform a routine inspection on aircraft tail number 860291, call sign Eagle 7. The plane was Captain Morrison's primary aircraft, and she knew he would be watching her work closely. The F-16 had just returned from a 2-week deployment to Red Flag, the Air Force's premier combat training exercise, and had been flown hard in realistic combat scenarios. As Maria approached Eagle 7, she began her visual inspection, looking for any obvious signs of damage or wear. The aircraft appeared to be in good condition, but she had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. The real test would come when she began her detailed examination of the systems that kept this machine and its pilot alive in the unforgiving environment of high-speed flight. She opened her toolbox and pulled out her inspection checklist, but her eyes were already scanning the aircraft with the practiced gaze of someone who understood that in aviation, the smallest oversight could have the largest consequences. Today, like every day, Maria would prove that her place on this flight line was earned through skill, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. 3 hours into her inspection of Eagle 7, Maria discovered something that made her stomach tighten with concern. Deep inside the engine bay, where most mechanics would never think to look without specific cause, she found microscopic metal shavings in the oil filter. They were so small that the standard inspection procedures would have missed them completely. But Maria's thorough approach caught what others would have overlooked. The metal particles told a story that Maria could read like a book. The size, shape, and composition indicated internal engine wear that was progressing faster than normal. It wasn't an immediate danger, but it was a warning sign that the engine was heading toward a potential failure if not addressed soon. She documented her findings and immediately flagged the aircraft for a more detailed engine inspection. Captain Morrison arrived at the hangar just as Maria was finishing her paperwork. He had a mission scheduled for that afternoon, a complex training exercise that would simulate a deep strike mission behind enemy lines. The scenario called for him to fly at low altitude through mountainous terrain, engage multiple targets, and return to base while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles. "What's the status on my bird, Santos?" Morrison asked, his tone carrying the impatience of a pilot who wanted to fly, not deal with maintenance issues. "Sir, I found some concerning wear indicators in the engine oil system," Maria replied, showing him the sample container with the metal particles. "I recommend we pull the engine for detailed inspection before the next flight." Morrison examined the tiny metal fragments and frowned. To him, they looked insignificant, barely visible even under the bright hangar lights. "These little specks? Come on, Santos, every engine produces some metal wear. That's why we change the oil regularly." "Sir, the quantity and type of particles suggest accelerated wear in the main bearing assemblies," Maria explained. "If we continue operating without inspection, we risk a catastrophic engine failure during flight. Look, I've been flying F-16 since before you knew what an airplane was," Morrison replied dismissively. "I can feel when something's wrong with my engine, and yesterday this bird flew perfectly." "You're being overly cautious." Master Sergeant Thompson approached, having overheard the conversation. He examined Maria's findings and found himself in a difficult position. The mission Maria was recommending would ground the aircraft for at least 2 days, disrupting training schedules and forcing expensive rearrangements. On the other hand, Maria had never been wrong about her mechanical assessments. "Santos, how confident are you about this?" Thompson asked. "Completely confident, Master Sergeant. The wear pattern is consistent with bearing degradation. We need to inspect the engine before the next flight," Maria replied without hesitation. Thompson weighed his options. The squadron commander had been emphasizing the importance of maintaining training schedules. Budget constraints meant that every grounded aircraft represented thousands of dollars in lost training opportunities. But safety was paramount, and Maria's track record spoke for itself. "I'm going to get a second opinion," Thompson decided. "Chen, take a look at this and give me your assessment." Technical Sergeant Chen examined the oil sample and the documentation Maria had prepared. He was thorough and methodical, checking her work against technical manuals and consulting with other experienced mechanics. After an hour of analysis, he reached the same conclusion as Maria. "She's right, Master Sergeant," Chen reported. The wear indicators are outside normal parameters. We should ground the aircraft pending engine inspection, but by this time the afternoon mission was approaching, and the squadron operations officer was pressuring the maintenance team to get aircraft ready for flight. Alternative aircraft were available, but switching would require briefing changes and could potentially delay or cancel the training exercise. Morrison made his feelings clear to anyone who would listen. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said to his fellow pilots. "She's looking for problems that don't exist, being overly cautious because she doesn't have the experience to know what's really dangerous and what's not." The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, was called in to make the final decision. Hayes was a seasoned officer who had worked her way up through the ranks in an Air Force that was still adjusting to women in combat roles. She understood the pressure Maria faced and the importance of supporting competent personnel regardless of gender. Hayes examined the evidence and consulted with the aircraft manufacturer's technical representatives. The wear indicators were borderline, in a gray area where reasonable people could disagree about the appropriate course of action. The conservative approach was to ground the aircraft, but operational requirements argued for continued flight operations with increased monitoring. "We'll fly the mission," Hayes decided, "but we'll limit the aircraft to training area Alpha, staying within gliding distance of the base. If Captain Morrison reports any unusual engine indications, he'll return immediately for landing." Maria felt a knot form in her stomach. She had done everything by the book, followed proper procedures, and made her recommendations based on solid technical evidence. But the pressure of operational requirements had overruled her mechanical expertise. She documented her objections in the aircraft logbook and ensured that all her findings were properly recorded. As the afternoon wore on, Maria found herself constantly checking the flight schedule board, watching for Eagle 7's return. The training mission was scheduled to last 2 hours, with Morrison flying a complex low-level route through the desert mountains of southern Nevada. The aircraft would be pushed hard, with rapid throttle changes, high G maneuvering, and sustained high-power settings that would stress every component of the engine. Technical Sergeant Chen noticed Maria's anxiety and tried to reassure her. "You did everything right, Maria. You identified a potential problem, documented it properly, and made your recommendations. That's all any mechanic can do. But what if something happens?" Maria replied. "What if I'm right and that engine fails during the mission?" "Then it won't be your fault," Chen said. "You warned them. The decision to fly was made above your pay grade." Meanwhile, in the Squadron Operations Center, Captain Morrison was receiving his final briefing for the mission. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and light winds. The training scenario called for him to penetrate simulated enemy airspace, engage ground targets with inert weapons, and return to base while avoiding simulated threats. Morrison felt confident in his aircraft and his abilities. He had flown this particular F-16 dozens of times and knew its quirks and characteristics. The engine had always performed flawlessly, and he attributed Maria's concerns to inexperience and overcautiousness. In his mind, she was trying to justify her position by finding problems that didn't really exist. As Morrison walked toward Eagle 7 for his pre-flight inspection, Maria was finishing her shift and preparing to go home. She had done everything she could to ensure the aircraft's safety, but the final responsibility now rested with the pilot and the chain of command that had approved the flight. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line as Eagle 7's engine spun up for taxi. Maria paused at the hangar door, watching as the F-16 rolled toward the runway. She said a silent prayer that she was wrong about the engine problems, that her concerns were just the product of excessive caution rather than genuine mechanical insight. But deep in her heart, she knew that the metal particles in that oil filter told a story of impending failure, and she could only hope that when it happened, Captain Morrison would be close enough to base to make it home safely. Captain Morrison advanced the throttle and felt Eagle 7 respond with its familiar surge of power. The F-16 rolled down the runway at Nellis, accelerating smoothly as the General Electric engine pushed the aircraft toward takeoff speed. At 140 knots, Morrison pulled back on the stick and felt the fighter lift gracefully into the clear Nevada sky. Nellis Tower, Eagle 7 airborne. Switching to departure, Morrison radioed as he retracted the landing gear and began his climb toward the training area. Eagle 7, contact departure control on 124.3. Good hunting, the tower controller replied, As Morrison climbed through 5,000 feet, everything felt normal. The engine parameters were all in the green. The aircraft was responding perfectly to his inputs, and the late afternoon visibility was unlimited. He pushed thoughts of Maria's warnings out of his mind, focusing instead on the complex training mission ahead. The route would take him south into the vast Nellis Range complex, where he would simulate a low-level penetration mission through mountainous terrain. The scenario called for him to avoid simulated radar sites, engage ground targets with inert training munitions, and then egress the area while evading simulated surface-to-air missiles. At 15,000 feet, Morrison leveled off and began his cruise toward the initial point of the training route. The engine was purring smoothly, producing exactly the thrust levels he expected. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel vindicated in his decision to overrule the mechanic's concerns. Clearly, Santos had been wrong about the engine problems. Meanwhile, back at Nellis, Maria had reluctantly left the base and was driving home to her small apartment off base. But she couldn't shake the image of those metal particles in the oil filter. In her 5 years of working on F-16s, she had developed an almost intuitive understanding of how these machines failed, and every instinct told her that Eagle 7 was heading for trouble. She pulled into a gas station and called the base maintenance control desk from her cell phone. "This is Staff Sergeant Santos. Has Eagle 7 reported any engine anomalies since takeoff?" "Negative," the duty controller replied. "All parameters normal. The mission is proceeding as planned." Maria felt a mixture of relief and doubt. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe her concerns about the engine wear were unfounded. But something deep in her mechanical intuition told her that the danger was real, even if it hadn't manifested yet. 40 minutes into his flight, Morrison reached the initial point of his low-level route and began his descent toward the desert floor. The training scenario called for him to fly at 500 feet above ground level, using the terrain to mask his approach from simulated enemy radar. This phase of the mission would require rapid throttle movements and aggressive maneuvering as he followed the contours of the mountainous landscape. As Morrison dropped below 1,000 feet, he pushed the throttle forward to maintain airspeed in the descent. The engine responded normally, but he thought he detected a slight vibration that hadn't been there before. He checked his engine instruments carefully, but all readings remained within normal limits. Probably just turbulence from the mountain ridges, he told himself, continuing his descent toward the valley floor. The low-level portion of the route took Morrison through a series of canyons and over ridgelines, requiring constant altitude and power adjustments to maintain both his planned track and safe terrain clearance. The F-16 performed flawlessly, responding to his every input with the precision that had made it one of the world's premier fighter aircraft. But 20 minutes into the low-level phase, Morrison noticed that the vibration was becoming more pronounced. It was subtle, felt more than heard, but it was definitely getting worse. He increased his scan of the engine instruments, looking for any indication of developing problems. At that moment, 200 miles away at Nellis Air Force Base, Maria was sitting in her apartment trying to concentrate on dinner preparation. But her mind kept returning to Eagle 7 and the metal particles she had found in the oil system. She had seen similar wear patterns before, always preceding major engine failures by days or weeks. The problem with bearing wear in jet engines was that it could progress slowly for a long time, then accelerate rapidly once a critical threshold was reached. The metal particles Maria had found suggested that Eagle 7's engine was approaching that threshold, but there was no way to predict exactly when the failure would occur. Morrison continued his low-level route, but the vibration was now noticeable enough to be distracting. He tried to convince himself that it was within normal limits, but his experience told him otherwise. Good pilots developed a feel for their aircraft that went beyond instrument readings, and Eagle 7 didn't feel right. As he approached the first simulated target area, Morrison had to make a decision. The conservative choice would be to abort the mission and return to base for an engine inspection. But that would mean admitting that the female mechanic had been right and that his judgment about his own aircraft had been wrong. Instead, Morrison decided to continue the mission but monitor the engine carefully. If the vibration got worse or if any instrument readings went out of limits, he would abort immediately. He convinced himself that he was being appropriately cautious while still completing his assigned training objectives. The target engagement required Morrison to dive toward the ground, simulating a weapons delivery against enemy positions. As he pushed the throttle forward and pulled the stick back in a climbing turn after the simulated attack, the vibration suddenly became much more pronounced. This time, Morrison couldn't ignore it. The vibration was strong enough to blur his instrument readings and could be felt throughout the airframe. He immediately pulled the throttle back to idle and began a climb toward safer altitude, preparing to declare an emergency and head back to Nellis. But before he could transmit his intentions, the vibration stopped as suddenly as it had started. With the throttle at idle, the engine was running smoothly again, and all instruments showed normal readings. Morrison was puzzled but relieved. Perhaps the problem was related to high power settings and would not affect his ability to return to base. He cautiously advanced the throttle again, watching for any return of the vibration. At 80% power, the engine seemed fine. At 90%, there was a slight tremor. At 95%, the vibration returned with a vengeance, accompanied this time by a barely perceptible fluctuation in the exhaust gas temperature gauge. Morrison now knew he had a serious problem. The engine was showing classic signs of internal failure, probably in the main bearing assemblies exactly as Maria had predicted. He was 150 miles from Nellis, flying over mountainous terrain with an engine that could fail completely at any moment. Nellis approach. Eagle 7 declaring an emergency, Morrison transmitted. His voice calm despite the gravity of his situation. I have engine anomalies and am requesting immediate vectors for return to base. Eagle 7 Nellis approach, copy your emergency. Turn left heading 360, climb and maintain 15,000. State nature of your emergency and souls on board. Eagle 7 turning left to 360, climbing to 15,000. I have engine vibrations and temperature fluctuations. One soul on board. Requesting emergency equipment standing by. As Morrison began his emergency return to Nellis, he realized that he was facing every pilot's nightmare. Flying a single-engine aircraft over hostile terrain with that engine showing signs of imminent failure. His survival now depended on nursing the failing engine back to base, and on the expertise of the ground crews who would have to help him get there safely. For the first time since takeoff, Morrison found himself thinking about Staff Sergeant Maria Santos and wishing he had listened more carefully to her warnings about Eagle 7's engine. The emergency klaxon echoed across Nellis Air Force Base as the crash phone activated every emergency response team on the installation. Within minutes, fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency response vehicles were racing toward their positions along the runway. In the Base Operations Center, controllers cleared all other aircraft from Nellis airspace and began coordinating the emergency response. Master, Sergeant Thompson was in his office completing paperwork when the emergency notification came over the base radio system. All personnel, we have an aircraft emergency inbound. Eagle 7 is declaring an in-flight emergency with engine problems. All emergency response teams report to stations immediately. Thompson's blood ran cold as he heard Eagle 7's call sign. That was the aircraft Maria Santos had wanted to ground for engine inspection just hours earlier. He grabbed his radio and headed for the maintenance control center, where the senior mechanics would gather to support the emergency response. The maintenance control center was a hub of activity as technicians pulled up Eagle 7's maintenance records, recent inspection reports, and technical manuals. The aircraft's history appeared on multiple computer screens as mechanics tried to understand what might have caused the engine problems Morrison was reporting. Technical Sergeant Chen was among the first to arrive, and he immediately began reviewing Maria's maintenance documentation from earlier that day. Her detailed report about the metal particles in the oil filter painted a clear picture of progressive engine bearing failure, exactly the type of problem that would cause the vibrations and temperature fluctuations Morrison was experiencing. Has anyone contacted Santos? Chen asked Thompson as they reviewed the maintenance records. She's off duty, Thompson replied. We can handle this with the people we have here. But as the emergency developed, it became clear that Eagle 7's situation was more complex than a simple engine malfunction. Morrison was reporting intermittent problems that varied with power settings, suggesting a progressive failure that could worsen at any moment. The aircraft was still 120 miles from base, flying over mountainous terrain with limited options for emergency landing sites. In the Air Traffic Control Center, controllers were tracking Eagle 7's progress and providing Morrison with vectors for the most direct route back to Nellis. The aircraft was maintaining altitude and airspeed, but Morrison's transmissions indicated that the engine problems were getting worse. Nellis approach. Eagle 7. Engine vibrations are increasing and I'm seeing fluctuations in oil pressure. Request emergency equipment standing by on the longest available runway. Eagle 7, copy all. Emergency equipment is in position. Runway 21. Left is available, 14,000 feet long. Winds are 240 at 8 knots. You're cleared for straight-in approach when ready. As Morrison struggled with his failing engine, the ground crews at Nellis were preparing for every possible scenario. The aircraft could make it back for a normal landing. It could require a dead-stick approach with no engine power, or Morrison might need to eject over the desert if the engine failed completely. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hayes arrived at the Maintenance Control Center and began receiving briefings from her senior maintenance personnel. When she learned that Maria Santos had identified potential engine problems earlier that day, her expression grew grim. "Where is Staff Sergeant Santos now?" Hayes asked Thompson. "She went home after her shift, ma'am. We tried to contact her but haven't been able to reach her yet." "Keep trying," Hayes ordered. "If anyone understands what's happening to that engine, it's probably her." Meanwhile, Morrison was discovering that his engine problems were becoming more severe as he got closer to base. The vibrations were now constant at any power setting above 70%, and he was seeing fluctuations in multiple engine parameters. He was forced to reduce power and accept a slower airspeed, which meant burning more fuel and increasing his risk of not reaching Nellis. Nellis approach, Eagle 7. I need to reduce power due to engine vibrations. This is going to increase my flight time. What's my fuel situation for reaching the field? Eagle 7, based on your current position and reduced speed, you should have adequate fuel for approach and landing with normal reserves. Continue present heading and advise any changes in your situation. At her apartment, Maria was trying to eat dinner when her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed the base maintenance control number, and she answered immediately. Staff Sergeant Santos. Santos, this is Master Sergeant Thompson. We have Eagle 7 inbound with an emergency. Engine problems, just like you predicted. Can you get back to the base immediately? Maria's heart sank, but she wasn't surprised. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, already grabbing her keys and heading for the door. As Maria drove back to Nellis, she thought about everything she knew about Eagle 7's engine and the specific problems she had identified. The metal particles in the oil filter had told a story of bearing wear that was accelerating beyond normal limits. Once that type of wear reached a critical point, the engine could fail catastrophically with little warning. The challenge now would be helping Morrison get the aircraft back to base safely while managing an engine that was progressively failing. That would require precise understanding of how the engine was likely to behave as the bearing wear continued, and what power settings and operating procedures would give Morrison the best chance of making it home. When Maria arrived at the base, she found the maintenance control center filled with senior mechanics and supervisors, all focused on supporting Eagle 7's emergency return. She quickly reviewed the radio transmissions and engine data that had been recorded since Morrison declared the emergency. The bearing wear is accelerating, Maria told the assembled group. The vibrations will get worse as the clearances increase and eventually the engine will seize completely. We need to help him manage power settings to minimize the stress on those bearings. Some of the mechanics looked skeptical. They had been trained to rely on technical manuals and established procedures, not on the intuitive assessments of a junior enlisted person, especially a woman. But Chen and Thompson knew that Maria's understanding of F-16 engines was exceptional. What do you recommend? Thompson asked. He needs to keep power settings as low as possible, avoid rapid throttle movements, and be prepared for complete engine failure at any time, Maria replied. If those bearings seize, he'll have about 30 seconds of warning before the engine shuts down completely. As if to confirm Maria's assessment, Morrison's voice came over the radio with increasing urgency. Nellis approach, Eagle 7. Engine vibrations are severe and oil pressure is dropping. I'm going to need emergency assistance for approach and landing. How far am I from the field? Eagle 7, you're 60 miles northeast of the field. Continue present heading and begin descent to 10,000 feet. Emergency equipment is standing by. In the maintenance control center, Maria looked at the engine data being transmitted from Eagle 7 and realized that Morrison was running out of time. The engine was failing faster than she had expected, and there was a real possibility that it would seize completely before he could reach Nellis. We need to get him on the radio, Maria said urgently. I can help him manage the engine to give him the best chance of making it back. The room fell silent as everyone realized what Maria was suggesting. It was highly unusual for a junior enlisted mechanic to provide direct technical guidance to a pilot during an emergency, especially when that mechanic was a woman who had been criticized for overcautiousness just hours earlier. But as Eagle 7's situation grew more desperate and Morrison's transmissions became more urgent, the traditional hierarchy that had kept Maria's expertise in the background was about to be challenged by the simple reality that she might be the one person who could save both the pilot and the aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked around the room at the assembled maintenance personnel, then made a decision that would challenge decades of military protocol. "Santos, get on the radio with Morrison. You know this engine better than anyone else here." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we have experienced NCOs here who should be handling pilot communications. Santos is just a staff sergeant. Santos is the mechanic who identified this problem hours ago when the rest of us were ready to ignore it," Hayes replied firmly. "Right now, Captain Morrison's life depends on getting the best technical advice available, not on following the chain of command." Maria felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders as she approached the radio console. Every eye in the room was on her, some supportive, others skeptical. She knew that if she made a mistake, it wouldn't just endanger Morrison's life. It would also set back the acceptance of women in aircraft maintenance for years to come. "Eagle 7, this is Nellis Maintenance Control," Maria transmitted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We have a specialist here who's familiar with your specific engine problems. Can you accept technical guidance?" Morrison's voice came back tense but professional. "Nellis Maintenance, Eagle 7. I'll take any help you can give me. This engine is getting worse by the minute. Oil pressure is fluctuating and the vibrations are severe enough to affect my instrument readings. Eagle 7, understand your engine is experiencing main bearing failure. The key is to minimize stress on those bearings while maintaining enough power to reach the field." "What's your current power setting?" "Currently at 75% power, trying to maintain 300 knots airspeed," Morrison replied. Maria quickly calculated the engine parameters in her head, considering the progression of bearing wear and the stress levels that different power settings would create. "Eagle 7 recommend you reduce to 65% power and accept a slower airspeed. The bearings will last longer at lower power settings, even if it takes you longer to reach the field." There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice came back. "Nellis Maintenance reducing to 65% power. The vibrations are definitely decreasing. How do you know so much about my engine problems?" Before Maria could answer, Master Sergeant Thompson stepped up to the microphone. "Eagle 7, you're talking to Staff Sergeant Santos, the mechanic who inspected your aircraft this morning and recommended grounding it for engine problems." The silence that followed was profound. Maria could imagine Morrison's thoughts as he realized that the person now trying to save his life was the same mechanic whose warnings he had dismissed just hours earlier. "Santos," Morrison finally transmitted, his voice carrying a new tone of respect and urgency. "What else do I need to know about this engine?" "Sir, the bearing wear will continue to accelerate," Maria replied. "You need to avoid any rapid power changes and be prepared for complete engine failure at any time. If the oil pressure drops below 15 psi or if you see a rapid increase in oil temperature, you'll have maybe 30 seconds before total engine seizure." As Morrison continued his emergency approach to Nellis, Maria monitored the engine data being transmitted from the aircraft and provided ongoing guidance. She could see the progressive deterioration in the engine parameters and knew that Eagle 7 was in a race against time. "Eagle 7, your oil pressure is trending downward. Recommend you begin a gradual descent to maintain airspeed with less power demand on the engine. Nellis Maintenance beginning descent. I can feel the engine getting rougher. What's my best approach profile for landing?" Maria consulted with Technical Sergeant Chen, who had extensive experience with emergency procedures. Together, they developed a plan that would give Morrison the best chance of reaching the runway before his engine failed completely. "Eagle 7, recommend a continuous descent approach with minimum power changes. Plan to cross the runway threshold at 160 knots with about 60% power. Then reduce to idle only after you're certain you can make the runway. Copy the approach guidance." "Nellis, how far am I from the field now?" Maria looked at the radar display showing Eagle 7's position. "Eagle 7, you're 25 miles northeast of the field. Cleared for straight-in approach to runway 21 left. Emergency equipment is standing by. As Morrison began his final approach, the tension in the maintenance control center was palpable. Everyone knew that the next few minutes would determine whether Maria's technical guidance would save Morrison's life or whether they would witness a catastrophic engine failure that could force him to eject over the populated areas surrounding Las Vegas. Nellis Maintenance. Eagle 7. Morrison transmitted, his voice tight with concentration. Oil pressure just dropped to 18 psi and the temperature is climbing rapidly. This engine is about to quit. Maria's heart pounded as she realized that Eagle 7's engine was reaching the critical failure point she had predicted. Eagle 7, you're 15 miles from the runway. The engine may seize at any moment. Be prepared to dead-stick the approach if necessary. Copy, prepared for engine failure. Maria, I want you to know that if I get out of this, I owe you an apology and a very big thank you. Despite the gravity of the situation, Maria allowed herself a small smile. Just get that aircraft on the ground safely, sir. We can talk about apologies later. Morrison was now flying one of the most challenging approaches of his career. With a failing engine that could quit at any moment, he had to balance the need to maintain airspeed and altitude with the reality that every second of engine operation brought him closer to catastrophic failure. Nellis Maintenance. Oil pressure down to 15 psi. The engine is vibrating so badly I can barely read my instruments. Eagle 7, you're 10 miles from the runway. Continue present approach path and be ready to glide if the engine quits. In the maintenance control center, Maria watched the radar display and engine data with intense concentration. She could see that Eagle 7's engine was operating beyond all normal limits, held together only by Morrison's careful power management and a combination of skill and luck. Eagle 7, 8 miles from the runway. How are your engine parameters? Oil pressure is at 12 psi and dropping fast. I don't think this engine is going to make it much longer. Maria made a split-second decision based on her understanding of engine failure modes. Eagle 7, recommend you maintain current power setting until you're certain you can glide to the runway, then reduce to idle immediately. Don't try to stretch the approach with a failing engine. Copy. We'll maintain power until I'm sure I can make the field. As Eagle 7 approached the critical point where Morrison would have to decide whether to trust his failing engine or commit to a powerless glide, Maria realized that everything she had learned about F-16 engines, all her experience and intuition, had led to this moment when her knowledge could mean the difference between life and death for Captain Morrison. The silence in the maintenance control center was deafening as everyone watched the radar display showing Eagle 7's final approach to runway 21 left. Morrison was 5 miles from the runway with an engine that was operating on borrowed time, its oil pressure hovering at a critically low 11 psi and falling. Eagle 7, you're looking good for the approach. The air traffic controller transmitted. Runway is clear, winds are 240 at 6 knots, emergency equipment is standing by. Morrison's voice came back strained but focused. Nellis Tower, Eagle 7 has the runway in sight. Oil pressure is now at 9 psi. This engine is about to seize. Maria leaned into the microphone, her voice calm despite the desperate situation. Eagle 7, you're 3 miles out and looking good for the runway. You can glide from your current position if the engine quits. Be ready to pull the power to idle the moment you're certain you can make the field. As Morrison crossed the 2-mile point, the inevitable happened. The oil pressure gauge dropped to 0. The engine vibrations became so severe that the entire aircraft shook, and a new sound filled the cockpit, the grinding noise of metal-bearing surfaces beginning to seize without lubrication. Nellis, Eagle 7. Engine seizure. I'm pulling the power to idle and dead-sticking the approach. In that critical moment, Morrison did exactly what Maria had prepared him for. Instead of trying to maintain power from the failing engine, he pulled the throttle to idle and committed to a powerless glide to the runway. The F-16, now essentially a very expensive glider, descended toward Nellis with only Morrison's skill and the aircraft's inherent aerodynamic qualities to carry them to safety. Eagle 7, you're cleared to land. Emergency equipment is rolling, the tower controller announced as fire trucks and ambulances raced along the runway. Maria watched the radar display with intense concentration, mentally calculating Eagle 7's glide performance and energy management. She knew that Morrison would have only one chance to get the approach right. Too high and he might overshoot the runway. Too low and he wouldn't make it to the pavement. Eagle 7, you're looking good for runway centerline, Maria transmitted. Remember to maintain 160 knots until you're certain you can make the runway, then transition to normal landing speed. Morrison was flying one of the most challenging approaches of his career. Without engine power, he had to manage his energy precisely, trading altitude for airspeed while maintaining enough speed to keep the aircraft controllable. The F-16 was not designed for powerless flight, and every pilot knew that dead-stick landings in fighters were among the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. Nellis maintenance. Eagle 7 is 1 mile out, 160 knots. Looking good for the numbers, Morrison transmitted, his voice steady despite the enormous stress of the situation. Maria felt her heart racing as she watched Eagle 7's final approach. Everything she had learned about aircraft systems, engine failures, and emergency procedures had led to this moment. If Morrison made it safely to the runway, it would validate her mechanical expertise and her decision to speak up about the engine problems. If something went wrong, she would carry the responsibility for the rest of her life. Eagle 7, half-mile out, you're looking perfect, the tower controller announced. Emergency equipment is in position. As Morrison crossed the runway threshold, he was exactly where he needed to be, on centerline at the right altitude, with enough energy to flare for landing, but not so much that he would overshoot the long runway. The months of training for emergency procedures and years of experience flying F-16s had prepared him for this moment. Eagle 7 touchdown, the tower controller announced as the F-16's main landing. Gear contacted the runway with a slight puff of smoke. The maintenance control center erupted in cheers and applause as Eagle 7 rolled down the runway, its powerless engine windmilling in the slipstream, but the aircraft and pilot safe on the ground. Maria felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized that Morrison had made it home safely. Morrison deployed his drag chute and applied wheel brakes, bringing Eagle 7 to a stop about 6,000 feet down the 14,000-foot runway. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles immediately surrounded the aircraft as Morrison shut down all systems and prepared to exit the cockpit. Nellis maintenance. Eagle 7 is safely on deck, Morrison transmitted, his voice filled with relief and gratitude. That was some outstanding technical support. Thank you for getting me home. As emergency crews checked the aircraft for signs of fire or other hazards, Morrison climbed down from the cockpit and was immediately met by medical personnel who would conduct a routine post-emergency examination. But his first request was to speak with the maintenance team that had provided the technical guidance that saved his life. Within minutes, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Master Sergeant Thompson, and Maria were driving toward the runway where Eagle 7 sat surrounded by emergency vehicles. The F-16 looked normal from the outside, but Maria knew that inside the engine bay, they would find the catastrophic bearing failure she had predicted, based on those tiny metal particles in the oil filter. As they approached the aircraft, Morrison walked over to meet them, his flight suit soaked with sweat from the stress of the emergency landing. His first action was to extend his hand to Maria. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I owe you my life," Morrison said, his voice carrying genuine gratitude and respect. "You were absolutely right about the engine problems, and your guidance during the emergency was flawless. I'm sorry I didn't listen to your warnings this morning." Maria shook his hand, feeling the weight of the last few hours finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. "I'm just glad you made it back safely, sir. That was some exceptional flying." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes watched the exchange with satisfaction. She had made the right decision in putting Maria on the radio with Morrison, even though it had challenged traditional protocol and hierarchy. The results spoke for themselves. Both the pilot and the aircraft had been saved by Maria's technical expertise and calm guidance under pressure. As the initial celebration of Morrison's safe return began to wind down, everyone knew that there would be extensive investigations into the engine failure, detailed analysis of the emergency response procedures, and formal recognition for those who had contributed to the successful outcome. But for Maria, the most important validation had already occurred. She had been proven right about the engine problems she had identified. Her expertise had been recognized and utilized when it mattered most, and she had demonstrated that technical competence and dedication to safety were more important than gender or rank when lives were at stake. As emergency crews began preparing Eagle 7 for towing back to the maintenance hangar, Maria looked at the aircraft that had almost claimed Morrison's life and felt a deep sense of professional satisfaction. The metal particles in the oil filter had told their story, and she had been there to read it correctly and act on what it revealed about the hidden dangers lurking within the engine's complex machinery. 3 weeks after Eagle 7's emergency landing, the detailed engine teardown had confirmed everything Maria had predicted. The main bearing assemblies had suffered catastrophic wear that progressed exactly as she had warned. The metal particles she found in the oil filter had been the first indicators of bearing degradation that would have led to complete engine seizure within hours of continued operation. The investigation report, prepared by a team of Air Force engineers and manufacturer representatives, concluded that Staff Sergeant Santos had demonstrated exceptional technical expertise in identifying the engine problems and providing crucial guidance during the emergency. The report specifically noted that her recommendations had likely prevented a catastrophic in-flight engine failure that could have resulted in the loss of both aircraft and pilot. In the weeks following the incident, word of Maria's role in saving Eagle 7 spread throughout the Air Force maintenance community. Her story became a case study in technical expertise, attention to detail, and the importance of listening to skilled mechanics regardless of their rank or gender. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes submitted Maria for several military awards, including the Air Force Commendation Medal for her technical expertise and the Airman's Medal for her role in saving Morrison's life. The citation specifically mentioned her ability to identify potential engine failure through careful analysis of maintenance indicators and her calm, professional guidance during the emergency. Captain Morrison, meanwhile, had become one of Maria's strongest advocates. He made it a point to speak at maintenance conferences and pilot training sessions about the importance of listening to skilled mechanics and not letting personal bias override technical expertise. His near-death experience had fundamentally changed his perspective on the relationship between air crew and maintenance personnel. I learned that the best mechanics don't just fix problems. Morrison would tell audiences, they prevent them. Maria Santos saw a catastrophic failure coming days before it happened, and when I ignored her warnings, she was still there to save my life when the engine finally quit. Every pilot should hope to have someone that's skilled and dedicated, working on their aircraft. The incident also led to changes in maintenance procedures at Nellis and throughout the Air Force. Maria's method of analyzing oil filter contents for microscopic metal particles was adopted as a standard inspection technique, and new guidelines were established for investigating maintenance concerns raised by experienced mechanics. Master Sergeant Thompson found himself fielding calls from maintenance supervisors at other bases who wanted to understand how Maria had developed her diagnostic skills. Her approach to troubleshooting engine problems became part of the curriculum at the Air Force's technical training schools, where instructors emphasized the importance of going beyond standard checklists to develop genuine understanding of aircraft systems. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitude of Maria's fellow mechanics. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been among her most vocal critics, approached her one day in the hangar with a genuine apology. "I was wrong about you, Santos," Rodriguez said. "I let my assumptions about women in maintenance cloud my judgment about your abilities. What you did with Eagle 7 was incredible, and I've learned something important about respecting competence wherever it comes from." Technical Sergeant Chen, who had always supported Maria, was promoted to Master Sergeant and became the new Chief of Engine Maintenance. One of his first actions was to recommend Maria for advanced training that would qualify her for promotion to Staff Sergeant and eventually Technical Sergeant. Maria has demonstrated that she has the technical knowledge and leadership potential to advance rapidly in the maintenance career field, Chen wrote in his recommendation. Her expertise saved an aircraft and a pilot's life, and her dedication to excellence sets an example for all maintenance personnel. The Air Force Times published a feature article about Maria's story, focusing on her journey from a small-town auto mechanic's daughter to a life-saving aircraft technician. The article highlighted the importance of diversity in maintenance fields and the value of different perspectives. In solving complex technical problems, Maria found herself invited to speak at Air Force recruitment events, technical conferences, and universities with aerospace engineering programs. She spoke about the importance of attention to detail, the value of hands-on experience, and the need to create inclusive environments where everyone's expertise could be recognized and utilized. The airplane doesn't care whether the person fixing it is male or female, Maria would tell audiences. It only cares whether that person has the knowledge, skill, and dedication to keep it safe. My job is to make sure every aircraft I touch is ready to bring its pilot home safely, and that's a responsibility I take very seriously. 6 months after the Eagle 7 incident, Maria was promoted to technical sergeant, making her one of the youngest people to achieve that rank in aircraft maintenance. She was also selected to attend the Air Force Institute of Technology for advanced training in aerospace engineering, a program that would prepare her for even greater responsibilities in her career. On the anniversary of Eagle 7's emergency landing, the 64th Aggressor Squadron held a special ceremony to commemorate the successful outcome and recognize the teamwork that had saved Morrison's life. Maria was presented with a plaque that read, "To Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, whose technical expertise, attention to detail, and calm professionalism under pressure exemplify the highest standards of Air Force maintenance excellence." Captain Morrison, now a major, spoke at the ceremony about the lessons learned from the experience. This incident taught all of us about the importance of listening to our maintenance professionals and respecting their expertise. Maria Santos didn't just save my life that day. She taught all of us to be better at what we do. As Maria looked around the hangar at her fellow mechanics, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she first found the metal particles in Eagle 7's oil filter. The skepticism and doubt that had once surrounded her work had been replaced by respect and recognition for her abilities. But for Maria, the most important validation wasn't the awards or the recognition. It was knowing that her work continued to keep aircrews safe and aircraft flying. Every day, she applied the same attention to detail and technical expertise that had saved Eagle 7, ensuring that other pilots would never have to face the emergency that had nearly claimed Morrison's life. The tiny metal particles in an oil filter had told a story of impending failure, but Maria's expertise had written a different ending, one where skill, dedication, and technical knowledge triumphed over prejudice and complacency. In the unforgiving world of military aviation, where the smallest oversight could have the largest consequences, Maria Santos had proven that excellence knows no gender, and that the best mechanics are those who listen to what the machines are trying to tell them.